In a part of the Ivory Coast called Bonon, a farmer, Diderot Mbra, arrives at his plantation to start work. It's remote, with mud tracks instead of roads and surrounded by forest. Without Diderot and millions of other smallholders like him in West Africa, there would be something missing from our world. There is a diversity of food on Diderot's plantation, including yams and plantains, but the crop that demands most of his time, the one that provides him with most of his income, and the one that gives billions of people around the world pleasure, he calls caboche. We know caboche as cocoa or cacao. It's March, time when the second harvest gets underway. The fruit grows in clusters directly on the trunks of trees, coloured yellow, orange and red. And inside the pods, packed into a sweet, delicious, milky mucus, are the beans, the source of chocolate.
Et là, ça devient jaune. Voilà, donc quand ça devient jaune, c'est mûr. On coupe, il est coupé.
We need to imagine a world without this harvest and without the steady source of the cocoa from West Africa, more than 60% of global supply. Because for the last couple of years, Diderot's world has been filled with chaos.
Jusqu'à présent, bon, ils ont dit 2800. Ben, jusqu'à présent,
I just don't understand what's been happening, he says. The price went up, but we didn't see more money. The price went down, and we couldn't sell our cocoa. Now we have no income, no money. I can't pay for my children's school. We can't buy medicine. It's the first time as a farmer, he says, that I've ever considered giving up growing cocoa. No surprise, Diderot and millions of other farmers in West Africa feel overwhelmed and exhausted. He's dealing with climate change, battling crop diseases, has been deflated by years of low prices. On top of this, his life has been impacted by financial markets and speculators based thousands of miles away, all of which, in the last 2 years, has led to cocoa shortages, price spikes, and a devastating crash, all at levels never witnessed before. At stake now is not only the fate of Diderot's cocoa farm, but also the future direction of a global industry worth $180 billion. In this programme, we'll be explaining the causes of this crisis and what it means to farmers and producers.
The spike is absolutely huge. The volatility has been like never before in the history of the cocoa market.
I have looked at this market for 25 years. I have never seen anything like that.
A lot of uncertainty. Everyone's concerned how they're going to afford or pay for their beans and get the chocolate to the consumer.
At the end of this supply chain, there's us. And this crisis is also raising questions about our role as buyers of chocolate.
Chocolate makers are making chocolate without chocolate, so kind of non-cocoa chocolate, or they're reducing the amount of cocoa in their chocolate bars. And my response is, that's terrible, because cocoa's wonderful and chocolate's wonderful, but also because by reducing cocoa consumption, we're taking people's livelihoods.
More on non-chocolate chocolate and the impact of our eating habits on farmers later. But first, let's go back to the Ivory Coast, the world's largest producer, where cocoa isn't grown in large commercial plantations, instead on small-scale farms, such as Diderot's. One of around 1 million farmers growing cocoa in the country. Reporter Jack Thompson visited him in March. It was a tense time. As the harvest was taking place, prices on global markets were tumbling.
Seulement, tu peux goûter les sucrés. Voilà, très sucré.
He's just cracked open the cacao pod with a machete, and inside is its white flesh. And he says that we can taste it. I'm going to take a bit, and it's soft and quite slimy. It's white. I'm going to eat it. It's quite sweet. And when you suck the white flesh off of it, you're left with a cacao bean that we're used to seeing.
Jack's with me now. Jack, I've tasted that white milky flesh coating the seeds of cocoa, and it is delicious. And on Diderot's farm in Bonon, where you were tasting it, that's in the west of the country. What's it like?
Cocoa country is humid and lush. There's a constant hum of insects and bird chatter. Kapok trees with their giant roots tower over the cocoa canopy with marshy rice paddies in between. We go down a red, earthy path to get to the cocoa farm to meet Diderot, a 38-year-old cocoa farmer. He has about 2.5 hectares of cocoa, which is about 2.5 football pitches. His whole extended family live and work on the farm. His sisters, parents, children, cousins, aunts, uncles, and there's a whole network of houses on the farm. And cocoa is what brings the vast majority of the money in. But his relatives also grow food to eat: yams, avocados, peppers, plantains, and chickens run around the yard where there are cocoa beans drying as well on the floor on a piece of tarpaulin.
And Jack, you watched as Diderot worked by hand with the machete, tending to every tree. And to grow cocoa involves a lot of work.
Diderot is a cocoa farmer through and through. He's focused on improving his production every year. It's enabled him to send his son to university in the capital to study geography, which is quite rare for a smallholder cocoa farmer. And he's really proud of the plantation that his father, Quadio, started in 1987 when the government encouraged farmers to grow more cocoa.
Chocolate is so familiar to us, but the fruit isn't, and you were surrounded by these strange-looking pods. As I mentioned, they don't grow from the branches of the tree, but out of the trunks.
The canopy of cocoa trees is a couple of meters overhead. Yellow and green pods dangle from the trees. They're bulbous and thick-skinned and not so different from a funky pumpkin. The alien-looking pods are kind of amazing, really, and it's incredible that they even come off a tree. But it's a constant task for Diderot to keep the plantation clean. He's clearing leaves and branches to keep pests and disease at bay, and it takes an entire team at harvest time to collect all the pods as they mature. Right now, he's preparing for the harvest in May, the smaller of the two harvests in the year.
And Diderot doesn't just harvest the pods, he also needs to carry out a highly skilled process on the farm. What's involved?
What Diderot does is that he puts it in banana leaf and he ferments it for several days. This process will reduce the bitterness. After the fermentation process, he spreads out all the cacao beans on a tarpaulin, and these are left to dry for 10 days or so, and all the pulp comes off it and dries until they're clean and ready to be transported.
As I mentioned, cocoa is grown by smallholder farmers, but it's traded as a global commodity on futures markets in New York and London, and passes through a supply chain controlled by a small number of corporations. And the way Diderot sells his beans, that's through the local cooperative he's part of. How does that work?
He sells his cocoa to a local cooperative in Bonon, the nearby town, and this is called EcoFab, and this stands for Entreprise Coopérative des Frères Associés de Bonon. And this cooperative sell it to Barry Callebaut, which is one of the biggest cocoa traders in the world.
You followed the beans from Diderot's farm. What's the journey like?
It's quite amazing because the cacao farms are really remote. We take this small lorry that sits a couple of meters above the ground to be able to navigate the really bumpy and remote roads. These trucks go out into the cocoa country to collect all the beans from the network of farmers. And we travel about half an hour to the cooperative.
And Jack, it was at the cooperative you started to see signs of a crisis unfolding. What was happening?
Yeah, we find that there are lorries sat outside full of cacao beans. And then when we go inside to the shop, we're greeted with this rich and earthy aroma of cacao. And this is basically a sign that none has been sold.
This is what the farmers were describing as the blockage. Cocoa beans they'd harvested in the winter of last year were stuck in warehouses, even piling up inside their homes. The market had become volatile, you could even say chaotic, with these unprecedented price spikes and falls. As we'll explain, this also contributed to global demand for chocolate being affected. As a result, the system seizes up. Incomes for farmers and their families stopped, resulting in little money for food, school fees, medicine, and also money they need to run their farms. Chaotic times, a real crisis.
His dad, who'd been farming since the 80s, he said that he'd never seen anything like it.
Bon, avant, c'était pas trop ça. Si c'est petit, ça coûte moins cher, mais on paye rapidement.
So he says that before you used to have your production and then you'd sell it with a click of your fingers. Now we've waited several months and he feels sad that he can't provide something for me to eat and drink, and that kind of goes against his spirit of hospitality. Ça veut faire ressentir quoi? Les émotions maintenant, c'est quoi? What are the emotions that you're feeling? Sorry, Quadio.
Mon souhait, n'a qu'à acheter à bon prix.
He says that he prays to God that they would be paid for what they've sold, because he wants to feed his kids well, send them to school, and that's it.
On va avoir l'argent à tout moment pour faire avancer les enfants. Bon, voilà.
He says what makes his heart hurt is that he has a daughter at university who's done really well, but I have nothing in my pocket, can't buy her books. That's what's painful.
Difficile de subvenir à nos besoins. Tu vois, on peut même plus faire quelque chose.
Right. And so he said, there's no money. If you fall ill, if you go to hospital, there's nothing left. So the situation is very precarious.
So what's gone wrong here? To explain, we need to go back a couple of years to 2023 and into the secret world of a small group of cocoa experts, the so-called pod counters. They were working their way through farms in the Ivory Coast and Ghana, gathering information. And someone who's had a rare glimpse into that world and this work is Javier Blas, commodities expert at Bloomberg and co-author of The World for Sale, Money, Power, and the Traders Who Barter the World's Resources.
These are a group of individuals who go every year to more or less the same farms, the same areas in the growing countries for cocoa, mostly Cote d'Ivoire, Ivory Coast, and Ghana. And they will go into a farm that they have visited probably multiple times. They will go to the same corner of that farm. They have pictures, have photographs, they have maps collected over the years. I have been in country in Ivory Coast with some of these pot counters, and I remember one very famous pot counter working for one of the big trading houses, deploying and opening a print map, a physical map. This is not like something on your smartphone, but an actual print map, which was held with tape, sellotape, because it has been folded so many times that it was just breaking apart on the seams. They will see the status of the crop. They will count how many pods are in each tree. They will take one or two pods. They will open them. Are they healthy? What is the quality? How they're developing? And then when they do that in multiple farms, counting several thousand cocoa trees or many thousand more of beans, they can, with a huge degree of accuracy anticipate what the total harvest for cocoa of Ivory Coast is going to be. And that information is gold.
This information is worth its weight in gold, particularly when something unusual is about to happen, which was definitely the case in 2023.
They started to send the reports back to headquarters. What they were reporting was something is not right. The crop is a lot lower than normal this time of the year. Then the industry became convinced that there was a shortage coming. But obviously, the first people who trade on that information are the companies that employ the pot counters. And these are some of the most sophisticated commodity traders, some confectionery companies, a big chocolate, if we want to call it like that. Some of the big chocolate companies employ their own pot counters, that they are in teams up country in West Africa, trying to give them a good look at what it's going to be, because that's when the companies say, okay, our pot counters are telling us that the crop is going to be low.
The looming cocoa shortage the pot counters were predicting was the result of a diverse range of factors. Long-term and short-term, structural and climatic, all converging in one cocoa season. 2023 saw the impact of a powerful El Niño effect that brought warmer temperatures, erratic rainfall and heat stress to the cocoa trees. Trees, which were old. Years of low prices meant farmers hadn't been able to invest in their farms, and so yields were falling and diseases were spreading, such as black pod disease and swollen shoot virus, a further hit to yields. Dr. Tanya Lander is a lecturer and researcher at the Oxford Martin School programme on the future of food.
Even with very, very intensive management, something like an apple tree will just eventually reach a point where it's not producing as much yield. And in the case of cocoa farmers, they see a big drop-off in yield after, say, 15 to 20 years is sort of the lifetime of good high yield, after which it starts to drop off. And so we're seeing in West Africa that many of the tree crops that have gone in are now reaching kind of maturity and past maturity, but the farmers may not have the economic resources to replace them.
When it comes to the impact of a changing climate, research recently published in Nature shows that for every 1 degree increase in temperature, global food production drops by 120 calories per person per day. That adds up to almost 5% of what the world eats. Tanya's own research saw this happening in cocoa.
All else being equal, so sort of soil resources being equal and rainfall being equal and management being equal, higher temperatures are worse for yield. What we found in our paper was that cooler temperature by up to 7 degrees centigrade during the hottest part of the year, that was related to a kind of 30% increase in yield. What that does mean is that as temperatures increase with climate change, then we expect that to drive an overall decrease in yield.
It sounds like a very significant effect on yield, Tanya, but does it explain the scale of the dramatic price spikes seen on global markets? That spike that took prices up from $2,000 a tonne to $12,000 a tonne. Could old trees and El Niño have caused that to happen?
I'm sure that was associated with a decrease in yield in that year. However, what I will say is that El Niño happens every kind of 3 to 7 years-ish. And the El Niño year that we had a couple of years ago was not an extreme year. If you look at a kind of graph of El Niño over the last 20 years, there have been much more extreme years. The price spikes were far beyond anything that can be explained by these kind of fundamentals.
So is this where the operation of the futures market and the work of traders and speculators exerts an influence?
I think what happened is that cocoa became interesting in a kind of market economics kind of way. And so then the drivers of the price shifted from being the fundamentals related to actual supply and actual environmental variables that we can measure, and shifted to becoming, this is an interesting commodity that can be traded by people who trade commodities without a particular interest in the commodity itself. They're not people who want to buy cocoa.
Looking on as cocoa prices shot up was Oren van Dort, a commodity analyst at Rabobank who specializes in cocoa. From the bank's HQ in the Netherlands, he watched as future markets in London and New York reacted to the information coming from the pod counters. This is where most of the world's cocoa is traded, and for almost 2 decades, things had been relatively uneventful.
If you look at the 2010s, the term we use is range bound. It was always trading a little bit between, 2,000 United States dollars per metric ton to maybe 2.5, and it deviated a little bit from that, and we saw a bit of a run-up in prices throughout 2023. And in 2024, suddenly, from February to April, it shot to about 12,000 United States dollars per metric ton, a little bit under that. And then it came down slightly throughout 2024, still at a very elevated level, like we're talking about 2 or 3 times the norm, before shooting back up again to 12,000 at the end of the year. Incredible volatility in the market, a lot of uncertainty. Price-wise, it was really more than just a roller coaster.
What we now know is that when the price hit around $8,000, so-called fundamentals such as climate and the yield of trees ceased to be the drivers of price, and instead complex financial mechanisms kicked in, driven in part by speculators.
Speculators, which could be the likes of managed money, are people that are essentially in the commodity because they might see an opportunity there, whether that's right or not, depends on their profit and loss in the end. Money quite literally means they're managing someone's money. So they see it as maybe an investment vehicle. And this could also include the likes of hedge funds.
Tonya Lander of the Oxford Martin School.
Those dynamics have their own internal logic. People are betting on the price going up, and then they're shifting to betting on the price going down. and those dynamics then create the kind of volatility in commodity markets that we see all the time. It's just that cocoa had been outside of that because it's a smaller market and it had been invariant for quite a long time. And so, I mean, to me, it's fascinating, and it's not my livelihood at stake. However, for the farmers, on the one hand, in countries where farmers can receive a price that's directly related to the market price, so that's outside of West Africa, then it was possible in some cases that they were receiving higher prices for their cocoa, even though they were producing less cocoa because of the climate drivers. But so they might be making more money than usual. In West Africa, in Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana, the price is set by the government at the beginning, the farm gate price, as it's called, the value that the farmers are receiving per ton of cocoa is set at the beginning of the season before the market gets its hands on it. And so that meant that in Ghana and Côte d'Ivoire, the farmers were receiving a set price irrespective of what happened on the market.
What made things worse was that when the global price crashed, farm gate prices set by governments in West Africa became much more expensive than those on the international futures market. This is what triggered a breakdown in supply chains and the blockage, in which cocoa piled up and farmers stopped being paid. Thousands of miles away from the futures markets of London and New York, all of this was playing out on Diderot's farm and in the lives of his family and community.
Comme c'est les dépôts ventes là, tu peux, dès que tu pèses, on te donne un reçu.
We signed a contract for our cocoa in October, he explains. That was for 2,800, but we haven't received any money. Now we're being told there's a new price of 1,200, less than half of what we were expecting. We might as well abandon the trees. Well, reporter Jack Thompson is still with me. Jack, what was happening to Diderot's income during that volatile period?
So when the price of cocoa hit historic highs at, $12,000, $13,000, $14,000 a ton, Diderot was receiving less than a seventh of this price paid on the global market. And this is because the Ivorian regulators, the cocoa regulators, fixed the price paid to farmers before the start of the season. And what was a kind of pretty brutal combination was that he only grew 30% of what he normally expected to produce due to prolonged droughts and erratic rainfall. He said there was no rain for 5 months. And then the regulators increased the price gradually, and And buoyed by the high prices on the international market, in August 2025, the regulators announced a record price paid to farmers in Ivory Coast, which is about $5,000 a tonne. Still under a half of what the international prices were, the peak international prices.
That must have given him hope that his income was about to improve, but that was before the price then crashed.
Yeah, so when they announced the high price, Diderot was happy, but also suspicious that it was perhaps too high. And he was right to worry, and the prices began to crash. And yeah, chocolatiers, traders and buyers stopped buying at the start of November, just as the main harvest was coming in, where farmers produced kind of 75% of the year's cocoa. And Diderot delivered just over 3 tons of cocoa to his cooperative, but it just sat in the shop. And when I visited Diderot on the farm, it had been 4 months that none of his cocoa had been sold. The idea of the world not wanting their cocoa was frankly unbelievable. And for Diderot and his family, the consequences of this cocoa volatility were really extreme. Even as a socially mobile and ambitious family, this volatility had really pushed them to the brink of poverty. And on a bit of a bleak note as well, his father said that he wouldn't even be able to pay for a funeral at this point.
So far we've focused on the supply side, the financial markets and the bulk cocoa trade. But at the other end of the supply chain, equally important and fascinating trends were taking place, including our chocolate buying and eating habits. COVID, conflict, the cost of living crisis, and years of inflation, followed by the volatility, all contributed to a phenomenon known as demand destruction. We were buying fewer bars, and at a global level, the industry was processing or grinding fewer beans. Oren van Dort of Rabobank.
Demand destruction is a term we use when we expect consumption, in this case, the amount of cocoa beans that are going to be grinded this season, to decline, and that is due to higher prices. If you suddenly see that the price of chocolate is twice as expensive, you might be less inclined to pick up that bar from the shelf. That would be demand destruction, or demand destruction in the cocoa bean sense that less is being grinded because the bar is being filled with more sugar or more milk or fruits or other kind of confectionery, while there's less cocoa being used because of the higher input costs of buying it. Therefore, there's less demand for using it, and therefore demand is essentially destroyed.
Time to hear from some of the big players in the chocolate world.
The cocoa supply chain in the last 2-3 years has been shaken in a way that has not happened for the last 30-40 years, probably never. And so there's something going on.
This is Dirk van der Pod of Mondelez International, owner of brands such as Toblerone, Oreo, and closer to home Cadbury. The business came under criticism for its use of shrinkflation, for example, offsetting rising costs of cocoa, dairy, and shipping by reducing some Cadbury dairy milk bars by 10%. In Germany in May this year, a German court ruled that Mondelez International misled consumers by covertly reducing the size of its famous milk chocolate bars. But on Radio 4, Van der Pod defended the practice.
From my perspective, what I believe, most consumers love their Cadbury. They wanna have their daily Cadbury. But they don't want, when they were paying, £1, suddenly pay £1.50 or £2 for the same quantity. They would like to continue to buy something at £1. So what do we do? Yes, we reduce sometimes the size. We don't do that in a malicious way. But if we look at how consumers make their decisions, the price point at which they can buy is very important for them. Yeah, people call it shrinkflation and so on, but it's not that we're trying to fool the consumer in any way or so, but it is, to our opinion, the best way to make sure that people can keep on enjoying their Cadbury.
Chocolate rival Tony Chocolonely challenges that view. It's arguing higher prices on supermarket shelves should be seen as something of a correction and an opportunity in the longer term for farmers to be able to invest. And so, as Tony's CEO, Douglas Lamont, argues, prices should stay high.
The pricing of paying a living income has now been priced into chocolate on the supermarket shelves. My argument is let's hold it there and reinvest in the farmer for more consistency, rather than saying, oh, this is an opportunity to throw this into lots of buy one, get one free multi-buys that's really good for the consumer in the short term, although probably not so good for their waistlines, and doesn't evolve, get us out of this entrenched issue in West Africa. I think if we all act responsibly, learn from this crisis and say, okay, this is an opportunity to invest in the farmer, not to take that money, not give it to the consumer and put it in our pockets as company profits, but to take that money and invest it in the farmer.
So the current price, Douglas, is around $4,000. That's still double what the industry has expected as the norm for many years. You see that as reflecting the true cost of chocolate, or at least a more realistic reflection of the cost of chocolate?
I think if the medium-term price and therefore as the farm gate price for the farmer settles on a market price of around 4,000, that enables a better investment in the farmer, getting them closer to living income prices, because ultimately they have been dramatically underinvested in the mechanisms that haven't helped them. And as a result, when a farmer is underpaid, they don't invest in their farm, they don't invest in productivity, they don't invest in disease management. And unfortunately, even worse, in this scenario, they have to ask their children to work on the farm rather than be able to hire workers to do some of that work. And you end up with the situation we've got, which is 1.5 million in child labour in West Africa, which for me, is a social issue, but it's a massive structural issue for the whole industry that we need to address. I think this crisis gives us an opportunity to learn and an opportunity to say, let's invest more consistently in the farmer to avoid these crazy spikes. Because yes, the climate event's going to become more common, but I would argue that the yield dipped around 30% 2 seasons in a row. I would argue if there had been good farm management, because the farmers had a little more money in their pocket to do that, yields would have been down, but they wouldn't have been down 30%. Let's call it, say, I don't know, but 10%. The world market price wouldn't have done what it done, and that's cost chocolate companies billions. So my call to CFOs of the big chocolate companies is, yes, there's a moral argument, but there's a very, very clear economic argument for change. Invest more consistently in the farmer over the time to avoid these crazy spikes in the market, driven by kind of panic and yield and all the rest of it, and then an opportunity for speculators to pile in on top.
Douglas Lamont of Tony Chocolonely. Meanwhile, Nestlé argues that it already has a mechanism in place to improve yields and create stability for farmers. This is its Income Accelerator program. Nestlé's head of environment, social and governance for chocolate is Stéphane Détal.
What is mainly very, very different than from any plans today is that we look at the family. We don't look only at the farmer. So we look at the spouse and we look at the farmer as that type of household. And we incentivize based on different practices, either at household level or at farm level. And this money is delivered through mobile money directly in the hands of the households, 50% to the women and 50% to the farmer. So it's disconnected from the price. One thing important, Dan, is that the price in Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana, the price that is delivered that is paid to the farmer is defined by the government, and we took the conscious decision to decode to build that program outside of purely the price, and also to deliver the money directly in the hands of the cocoa farming families. So what does that mean? Is the amount is a fixed amount based on different practices. So the smaller the farmer is in terms of size, the more impact. So we will proportionally impact more smaller farm holders than bigger, because we have a 500 euro incentive at a max that we deliver to the household.
If, for example, a farmer adopts practices such as pruning to improve the health of their trees, their household income is increased. Industry observers, however, highlight the fact this programme involves 45,000 farming families, a strong share of Nestlé's direct supply chain, But that adds up to a tiny proportion of cocoa farmers across West Africa, so it needs wider adoption across the industry to make a bigger impact. Meanwhile, the price shock led the Ghanaian and Ivorian governments to hold high-level meetings to work out ways of getting more value for the cocoa their farmers are growing, more than half of global supply. This includes utilising their supply power and becoming the OPEC of chocolate. Thomas Nardi is the BBC's senior reporter in Ghana.
The two countries recently met at a summit to determine the future of cocoa. And then they both agreed that they needed to align their pricing policies, which means that they will now all have a uniform kind of pricing when it comes to cocoa so that they can have a better bargaining power on the international market. The two countries also agreed that they will now go into processing, adding value to the cocoa instead of just processing or selling the beans to international buyers. They will now add value, like using it to produce other products and then sell them, so that they won't, in future, they won't have this situation of bags of cocoa beans piling up on the international market. And when prices fluctuate, then it impacts the farmer. And so they are also thinking of establishing industries. And that is where it gets tricky, because you need money and a lot of investment to be able to establish these processing factories.
You mentioned about this future in which there will be more processing. But I'm wondering, what is the relationship between the wider population and cocoa? Is Ghana a chocolate-eating nation, or is this a story of Ghana producing a crop for production and pleasure in the rest of the world?
Well, that's an interesting question. Ghana is a chocolate-eating nation. We have chocolates being produced locally, and then we also have some that are being imported into the country. There are a number of entrepreneurs who are into the chocolate industry in this country, and they are doing so well. And that is why the government is thinking of establishing more industries to ensure that the beans are processed locally. So I love chocolate a lot, and so I buy the Ghanaian chocolate, and I'm sure one day you also have a taste of it. Have you tasted Ghanaian chocolate before?
I haven't, Thomas, and I want them to get one day. I hope to, because that would be. I think to actually taste chocolate in Ghana, in the country where the crop grew, where the cacao is growing, I think that's an important thing.
Very important. And very, very important. So it's something that the government is considering, and then they are also thinking of establishing more industries to ensure that the farmers get value for money.
Meanwhile, there's a boom in interest from the big chocolate companies in developing alternatives to cocoa. Cargill, for example, one of the most influential traders, has teamed up with Voyage Food to supply a cocoa-free product called Nexcoa, using crushed grape seeds sourced from the wine industry, whereas Nestlé and Barry Callebaut are both developing alt chocolate products with innovators Planet A Foods. It's clear millions of farmers in West Africa will face big decisions about the future of their plantations and their livelihoods. Let's return to where we started, in the Ivory Coast, and the story of Diderot and the cooperative in Bonon. Jack, it's 3 months since you reported from the Ivory Coast. What's the latest with Diderot and his harvest?
So I spoke to Diderot last week, and he's managed to sell most of his cocoa, but he says that he has basically little confidence left in the system that was designed to protect him. And basically, he doesn't have much of a choice. He says that he will continue to grow cocoa, but all he can do, in his words, is to pray by the grace of God that the price is good and the buyers pay on time. Others, however, have taken more extreme action. When we went to the cooperative to find more about the blockages and the volatility, we saw that farmers were gathering to have a meeting. And when we sat in on this meeting, we heard farmers share their experiences. And one particularly livid farmer, Kwame Kitongo, was describing the impacts of their, in his words, poverty deepening.
Je vais couper parce que J'ai coupé aussi. On est en train de couper, les enfants sont là.
That he was so fed up that he'd cut down his cacao plantation and was growing rubber instead.
Jack Thompson. And what about us? We spend more than £13 billion on chocolate in the UK, a significant amount of money with which to tweak a part of the food system. Over to Tonya Lander, researcher at the Oxford Martin programme on the future of food.
If we can kind of consider ourselves as part of the global community of people engaged with cocoa in one way or another, right? So we're engaged as consumers, farmers are engaged as producers, people in the middle are engaged as buyers and sellers, and the farmers and the buyers and sellers are all making their livelihoods off of this product. And so by reducing cocoa consumption, we're taking people's livelihoods. And so as consumers, our choice ideally isn't to not eat cocoa and isn't to eat chocolate with less cocoa in it. Our choice ideally would be to buy cocoa that protects farmers' livelihoods and protects the environment. So as consumers, if we can make those choices, not just because we care about our own health, but also because we care about the welfare of the farmers and their livelihoods, then I think that's a good thing to do.
And if you want some ideas about how to find the good stuff, in the Food Programme archive, you will find many editions profiling a wide range of producers. Please have a listen and experiment. Perhaps it will be a fun and delicious way to make a difference.